International donors meeting here in Berlin today pledged 1.5 billion euros for Sudan. But that still falls short of what aid agencies say is needed. A devastating civil war has killed tens of thousands of civilians and displaced millions more. As the conflict enters its fourth year, the United Nations is calling for a humanitarian ceasefire.
Sudan is facing the most severe humanitarian crisis in the world. In a new report, the United Nations says almost two-thirds of the population is now in urgent need of assistance. More than 150,000 people have been killed and over 11 million displaced since war broke out in 2023 between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. The report found that poverty is now at its most extreme since the 1980s, with millions living under the threat of famine.
We were in El Fasher when the war started. It was terrible. If you can't find food for your children, they go without. There are no jobs. The only aid we get is from the United Nations.
The UN says recovery is still possible if peace is restored, but warns that every month war continues, the more difficult it gets. The Berlin conference aimed to raise enough money to provide aid to 14 million people. Attended by foreign ministers and other delegates from more than 50 countries, it drew large contributions.
Germany pledges 212 million euro of our humanitarian assistance to Sudan and the neighboring countries.
Norway today commits 42 million euros for humanitarian efforts and early recovery.
So I can confirm today the UK will commit £146 million, that is over 165 million euros, in life-saving aid to Sudan. And as part of that, the UK will double our support to local aid groups, including the emergency response rooms and women-led organisations.
But total donations fell short of the target. Delegates also called on the warring parties to agree to international efforts for a peace deal.
To the Sudanese army and the Rapid Support Forces, I say again, there is an alternative to war. You must commit to the path of negotiation and peace.
With none of the leaders of those parties present, ministers faced an insurmountable challenge. But this third Sudan conference has at least temporarily drawn attention back to a conflict that is being forgotten among other global crises. Delegates hope it will serve as a wake-up call that the war in Sudan is not going away and that the Sudanese people are still suffering.
Well, DW's Tina Gerhäusser was at the talks here in Berlin. She has more now on the international aid effort for Sudan.
The pledges coming from the Sudan conference here in Berlin are higher than we could have expected in times of budget cuts of humanitarian aid. But it's still less than needed. The UN says 2.5 billion euro are necessary to better protect and to feed the people in Sudan. The German foreign minister calls the crisis apocalyptic. He promises to put pressure on the wartime enemies and pressure on the players that are still delivering weapons. This political pressure is crucial. The UN High Commissioner of Human Rights and the French Foreign Minister are calling for the extension of an embargo, an arms embargo, to the entire territory of Sudan. And the Sudanese civil society organizations that came to this conference, they are asking for a ceasefire. They have plans for a transition process and they are counting on the international community.
A few moments ago, I spoke with Arjimand Hussain. He's the director for the Sudan crisis with the aid group Plan International. I asked him about the current situation and how his organization is trying to help.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me in your program. Plan has been working in Sudan for many decades, as you rightly said, for about 5 decades. And we have been working on various development issues in the country, like education, protection, livelihoods, women's rights, and so on and so forth. But over the last 3 years, a lot has changed. As you know, that the country has been in the middle of a very serious conflict since April 2023. And as a consequence of that, millions of people have been displaced from within Sudan and also to the neighboring countries of Egypt, Chad, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Central African Republic, besides Libya as well. So we have a situation where about half the country is displaced and about 19 million people are currently food insecure. They are facing hunger situation.
So the scale of this conflict is big. It's a huge scale, isn't it?
It is staggering. It is staggering. And as what the UN has already said, it's the world's biggest humanitarian crisis in terms of the number of people affected, in terms of number of people displaced from their homes, in terms of the number of children out of school. We are talking about at least 8 million children being out of school in Sudan for the last 3 years now, which basically risks, an entire generation being lost without education. Then we are also seeing another big, yes.
Sorry, I was just going to say it really is staggering what's going on there. You've just given us, a thumbnail picture of some of the more serious numbers. What would you say, given that scale of displacement and food insecurity, what is most needed at this point to relieve the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Sudan?
At the moment, the biggest crisis at the moment is that the kind of funding that Sudan has been receiving over the last 3 years, when we saw in 2023, the total funding available for meeting the humanitarian needs in Sudan was barely 35%. And today in 2026, we are seeing that we only have barely 16% of funding required for Sudan to make food available to the affected population, to make sure that children are protected, to make sure that we have some basic transitional education available for children. So there's a huge, I would say, gap in the funding needs and the availability of funding for Sudan currently. And we are urging the international communities, the whole humanitarian system, to rise up to the situation and provide greater support so that not only local responders, local humanitarian actors in Sudan are able to provide humanitarian assistance to the affected population, but also the other humanitarian agencies like PLAN, which are already working in multiple, conflict-affected areas and also active hostility areas like Darfur, like Kordofans, like North Darfur. So these are the areas where humanitarian agencies need to be on the ground to be able to meet the humanitarian needs.
And it's very difficult, of course, to access those areas when there's such an active conflict going on. It's extremely dangerous. When you say that the money available to meet the immediate humanitarian needs is only about 16%, I mean, that implies that over 80% of the needs are not being met. What does that look like on the ground?
That looks like, we have had these emergency response groups or the emergency response rooms on the ground in Sudan, basically local volunteers groups which were running community kitchens. When the United States funding was paused or stopped for Sudan and other parts of the world, we have seen most of these emergency response rooms basically closing down the kitchens. And then we also have, multiple other healthcare facilities across Sudan, which have been closed because there is no funding available. So we are talking of a situation not only, people not being able to access their basic food needs, but also critical healthcare requirements which are being provided by these fundings.
So
we are
people
still
are
not
dying,
talking about education.
But people are dying there now for the lack of aid that you've been talking about.
Unfortunately, yes. If we see the latest reports with regard to the famine situation, situations when children and families are not able to get adequate food. We see, for example, in the North Darfur areas of Kornoi and Abbaro, very remote locations to the north and to the west of Sudan near the Chadian border. We are talking about 5 to 7 children out of 10 children basically starving. And these are the kind of figures we don't have available for the whole of Sudan. We are not able to access areas to gauge the extent of this crisis in other parts of Sudan. And then we have a similar situation down south in the Kordofan region as well. So basically, as you rightly said, children are starving, people are starving, and we are not able to provide adequate support to them in these circumstances.
It's horrible. After 3 years of fighting in Sudan, do you see any viable path to peace?
We see a glimmer of hope with initiatives like the International Sudan Conference, which is currently being held in Berlin. We have seen, some good positive movements with regard to, bringing a qualitative change or bringing some improvement in the lives of the people. What seems positive that multiple governments in Berlin today have made commitments. One with regard to providing greater financial assistance to the humanitarian needs in Sudan. We have heard from the governments of Germany, the UK, the Norway, and even the French making commitments for greater humanitarian financial needs in Sudan, which is quite positive. At the same time, what we have seen is that for the first time, multiple civil society actors of Sudan have come together in sharing their views about the future of Sudan. How do they want to build the future of peace for the country, which is quite significant because some of these groups, whether these are civil society groups, whether these are youth groups, women-led groups, their voices do matter. And we believe that the more the civil society voices are able to talk about the imperatives of peace in Sudan, the better. And that is one of the key objectives that has been achieved at the conference in Berlin.
A final question. The world's attention right now seems fixed on other crises like the Middle East or, for Europeans, Ukraine. There's comparatively little reporting on Sudan, despite knowledge of what you've been telling us. How do you explain that kind of neglect?
Well, we do recognize, there are other dire crises as well. Ukraine has been a major crisis. Then the latest Middle East crisis is another one with millions of people being affected, whether in Gaza, whether in Lebanon and other parts within Iran itself. We do recognize, that needs attention as well. But when we look at the Sudan situation, the scale of this crisis, the number of people who have been affected, and the kind of funding available, we talked about barely 16% of the funding being available to meet the humanitarian needs, which is quite paltry, which doesn't really, do anything in providing a basic protective environment for the affected population, mainly for children and girls. So therefore, we think that, it's a very dire situation. It may sound like a cliche, but when we visit Sudan on the ground, I was recently in Darfur, and what we see there on the ground is quite a distressful and a precarious situation. And we believe that the international community must pay greater attention despite what all is happening around the world. The asks are not big, the kind of funding required for meeting the humanitarian needs in Sudan. For instance, the German government is talking about being able to mobilize about $1 billion from this conference for aid pledges. That is doable, and that's not really a big amount of an ask for Sudan. So we believe it is doable. We believe that if there is greater international commitment for these needs, we will be able to save more lives in Sudan.
Arjimand, thank you very much for taking time to talk with us today. That was Arjimand Hussain, Regional Response Director for the Sudan crisis with Plan International.
Thank you very much.